We're speaking today with Mr. Paul Goble. He's an expert on Eurasian affairs and has taught in various foreign universities, including Estonia. I'd like to speak to him today about recent events concerning overflights by Russia of American warships and planes in the Baltic. Mr. Goble, can you tell me what is the significance of these recent overflights or buzzing on the part of Russian warplanes in the Baltic over American warships and American Air Force and Navy jets?
It's clearly an effort by Moscow, by Vladimir Putin, to test NATO, to try to show that
Why do you think Mr. Putin is taking these highly risky maneuvers? Now, I understand that Secretary Kerry called this a provocative and reckless act on the part of Russia, and that also that U.S. funding of NATO will be increased in this next round. Would not these be adequate responses on the part of the United States to these provocations?
saw what happened when Turkey shot down a Russian plane that violated Turkish airspace. We went very quickly to the assumption that there might be a war between Turkey and Russia. I don't think Mr. Putin wants a war with NATO. I think he wants to show that NATO is a weak institution, to the extent that the United States, as Secretary Kerry has suggested, plans to beef up NATO. I think it becomes less likely that Mr. Putin will risk these kinds of things again.
Was this a short-term kind of tactical feint on the part of Mr. Putin against the United States and NATO then?
Well, I think there is a general strategy that Mr. Putin has of trying to recover the standing in the world that the Soviet Union had before 1991 as sort of a co-equal of the United States. The Russian Federation today is clearly not the equal of the United States economically or in terms of ideological influence. It still has enormous military capacity, and when you don't have the ability to challenge an opponent economically or ideologically, there is a temptation, and Mr. Putin seems to have fallen for it, of using military tactics. But I think it has to be understood as a tactic within this broader strategy of rebuilding the image of Russia as a great power, as co-equal to the United States in terms of what can be done in the international political system.
What do you think would be the effect of introducing a permanent NATO force in Poland, as I believe it was the Prime Minister has requested?
Well, I have been in favor of it for a very long time. It seems to me that one of the great untold stories about NATO expansion is that the great winner of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe has been Russia, because every time the West has expanded the alliance eastward, it has made promises to Russia as to what it will and won't do. My own sense is that every alliance member needs the tripwire of forces from elsewhere that a permanent base would consist of. If there were, let us say, an American base in Estonia, and if the Russian government were to send in its forces, no American president could fail to respond to American losses. On the other hand, such base in Poland, then a Russian move probably doesn't have the same consequences of a Western reaction. And I think both the Russians know that, and people in between the Poles and the Estonians, the Latvians, and the others know that. So, given Russia's new revanchist policies toward its neighbors, I believe putting an American or a NATO base in Poland would help stabilize the situation. To be sure, the Russians would be outraged, they would complain, they would say they were being betrayed, they would talk about a new Cold War, but the fact is, the reason the Poles want a NATO base on their territory is precisely because they feel threatened by the policies and statements and behavior of the government in the Russian Federation.
I understand that in the meeting between NATO and Russia today, that the Russian ambassador said that in future that Russia would take, as he said, all necessary measures, precautions to compensate for these attempts to use military force. What is Russia actually prepared to do?
Well, I think one of our problems is that what Russia may be prepared to do is a far more open thing than we had assumed. No one believed 5 years ago that the Russian government would try, and so far successfully, annex part of the territory of Ukraine. But that's exactly what it's done. So it's an open question as to what Mr. Putin may do. The fact that today there was a resumption of the NATO-Russia Council, which had been suspended for the last 2 years, is, in my view, a positive thing in that it is always better, if you can, to talk rather than to fight. Having said that, it has to be made very clear to the Russians that the reason the NATO-Russia Council was set up was to reduce tensions, not to promote them. And if the Russian representation at that council is talking about America or the West creating threats to Russia, that's not very helpful. None of the places that have gotten Western support, NATO support, American support, have failed to ask for it. Most of these countries, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, have asked for more help than they've been given. And they've asked for it because they feel threatened. I hope that the Russian government will change its policies. I hope even more that the Russian government will ultimately change its leadership, because I think the things that Mr. Putin has been doing put the world closer to the kind of military conflict that no one can want. That the Russian government has behaved in violation of international law, in violation of international agreements, and that it acts as if it's entitled to do that because it, quote, can. I don't think that's a good way to run foreign policy. I don't think it's a good way for any country to run its foreign policy.
Mr. Goble, what connection do you see, if any, between these developments in the Baltic Sea to Russia's involvement in the conflict in Syria?
Well, I think it's all part of a general effort. Putin sent Russian air power into Syria to defend his ally, Bashar Assad, the Syrian dictator, and to make sure that the people who were fighting against ISIS and also against him would not be in a position to defeat Assad's government. Mr. Putin is a status quo leader who doesn't want to see changes because he fears change. I think that Mr. Putin's announcement that he was pulling out of Syria, which in fact he has not done, but his announcement meant that in order to maintain his legitimacy with the Russian people, he needed to up the ante somewhere else. And I think the buzzing of NATO warships was part of that plan. So in that sense, they're connected.
Now, moving to another part of the world that I know you're familiar with, Azerbaijan. Can you fill us in a little bit? What's going on right now with these reports of renewed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, since 1988, there has been a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory of Karabakh and 7 adjoining regions of Azerbaijan, all of which are occupied by Armenian forces, which are supported, it has to be said, by the Russian government. Both the government in Baku and the government in Yerevan have interest occasionally in reigniting the conflict as a way of deflecting criticism of their regimes and also of winning popular support. The recent military reemergence of the conflict in eastern Karabakh with the advance of some Azerbaijani units has won President Aliyev enormous support in Azerbaijan. This is one of those international conflicts of which there are all too many, where there is no easy answer. You have an ethnic Armenian area that historically, in Soviet times, was part of Azerbaijan, that wanted to separate from Azerbaijan, and you have Azerbaijan that wants to maintain its territorial integrity. So you have a conflict between two principles that the international community supports, between the right of nations to self-determination and the right of nations to maintain their territorial integrity. There is no easy solution here. Especially if you start from the proposition that if borders must be maintained, then ultimately self-determination is going to be put in second place. If self-determination is held as primary, then national borders will be changed. Though that kind of a zero-sum outcome is one that is very, very difficult for people in the Caucasus or more generally to address.
I understand you've written or edited several books on international policy and of the region of your interest. Can you tell us whether you're planning any new work?
Well, my primary way of communicating to the world, as it were, is a blog, Window on Eurasia 2, which I put out usually between 3 and 5 articles a day, calling attention to developments in the region. Things are moving at such a pace that it seems to me, at least in terms of my own skills and interests, more important just now to try to provide data points about each step that's being taken, rather than to pull back and do a more comprehensive picture. I do write for a variety of Western publications, and I have done more general things. But right now, things are moving very fast. It is worth noting that the European Community Council on Foreign Affairs has just put out a major paper, not mine, but a major paper, suggesting that the Putin regime has no more than a year left. That's a remarkable statement, which would not have been made until very recently, and it is a reflection of just how fast things are moving and how much we need to pay close attention.
One last question: do you think Putin really has only 1 year left?
I think that probably overstates the case, because I think one of the things Mr. Putin has demonstrated is his willingness to use force against his opponents, and that the willingness to use force, even what used to be called in Gorbachev's time big blood as opposed to little blood, but the willingness to use major military force and security force probably means that he can hold on longer than that. But the fact that people in Europe are talking about Putin in terms of not decades but a year or two, even if a year is too short, it's clearly the case that this is not someone who's going to be in the Kremlin 5 and 10 years out. And that will represent, depending how it comes about, will determine a very great deal about what that part of the world is like, and because of the importance of that part of the world, what our world will be like as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goble. We've been speaking today with Paul Goble of the Institute of World Politics. He's an expert on Russia and diplomacy, among other fields, and we appreciate hearing from him today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.